This is the lecture video 694 through 703. Urbanization impacted every part of the United States, every region. Urbanization, growing of towns or cities. Older industrial towns of the Northeast and Upper Midwest grew the most, attracting migrants from rural South and Appalachia. Rural Southerners also flocked to southern cities, so the cities start to get larger and larger because farming is so hard to make a living at. Also, because manufacturing now, with the assembly line and standardization of parts, makes it to where factories can use more workers. Western cities grow rapidly as well, especially Los Angeles, that becomes the fifth largest city in 1930. The population boom changes the urban landscape. You can't build out a lot of times and make the city bigger, but you can build up. Skyscrapers are starting to be built. Land values go crazy. And as you can see here, this is the population areas that grow or that lose during this time frame. And we have population loss in our area right up here. While Southern segregation and violence made migration attractive to African Americans, Northern job opportunities made it possible. Yeah, it's great. It's a great idea to be able to move north to get out of being in racism and segregation and everything else, but what are we going to do? Well, when the job opportunities open, this is known as the Great Migration. And more than 1.5 million African Americans moved to northern cities in the 1920s. Where they crowded into ghettos, worked at jobs that offered salaries less than those of whites, but there isn't as much racial violence in the beginning. Migration brought African American communities political and economic power, autonomy, and increased racial consciousness so they can choose what they want. They can vote. They can do things. Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association espoused racial pride and black nationalism. Marcus Garvey's great. He has this whole idea to go back to Africa, and he's a dreamer. He wants African Americans to improve themselves. It doesn't work out well for Marcus Garvey. He ends up being thrown out of the United States, but he makes a name for himself and really makes African Americans be proud of who they are during this time frame. The Harlem Renaissance is a boom in literature, art, and music in the 1920s. This is called the New African American movement, where African Americans, it starts in Harlem, New York, with the Apollo Theater, and it's where African Americans for the first time make music, poetry, literature for themselves. Not for anybody else, just for themselves. And jazz is involved. Jazz is amazing. Some of my favorite poets, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Thurston, she's more of a novelist, but great writers of this time frame. And it's just this explosion or this boom of African American culture through literature, art, and music in the 1920s. Here's Zora Neale Thurston. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. Great book. Hispanic migrants also came to cities in the 1920s, creating communities called barrios. Puerto Ricans migrate to New York City, but for Hispanic migrants, Mexico supplied the most immigrants. Racism restricted Hispanics to racially defined districts, just like African Americans. So there's not much difference between African Americans and Hispanic Americans and how they're treated. In 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens organized to advance civil rights for Hispanics. They don't really get a whole lot. The problem that ends up happening for Hispanic Americans is the Great Depression starts. When the Great Depression begins, there's not enough jobs for Americans. And so Hispanics go back home. The number one reason for immigrants to come to the United States is prosperity. jobs. And when they don't have that, if you're going to financially be weak, then why don't live in your own home country? So the draw for people to come to America isn't there. Making tortillas. Suburbs grew twice as fast as cities in the 1920s. This due in part to people don't want to live in the cities. This is made possible by the car. Automobiles created the modern suburb, which is a sprawling, dispersed area, single-family home surrounded by a green lawn that becomes the social ideal. Everybody wants that. If you take Texarkana, for example, not very many people live downtown. People are moving out of the downtown areas and moving to the suburbs of Wake Village, Pleasant Grove, Liberty Hollow, things like that. Now, in this time frame, you had Rose Hill, you had Beverly. These were the places everybody wanted to live. But many of these suburbs excluded Jews, African Americans, and Hispanics, and working class people. It's very unfortunate, but that's the way it was. Neighborhoods were very segregated. The rise of suburbs stimulated highway construction, and with the automobile leads to the creation of new industries, including shopping centers, drive-in restaurants, fast food franchises, motels, hotels, you name it. All the conveniences that we use if you go on a long road trip all become normal things due to the car. There's no sense in having a fast food restaurant or a drive-in restaurant if, their food gets cold by the time you get there, by the time you get back home. So that's with the adaptation of the car. It works great. All right, Jazz Age. Advertising focused on consumption, and it helped shape the new society. Traditional virtues of thrift, prudence, and avoidance of debt are replaced by consumption. Consumption. We want it now. Give it to us now. We don't want to wait for it. We're going to buy it. We'll worry about paying for it later. Advertising is used via print, skywriting, new media. Advertisers exhorted Americans to buy a growing number of goods and services. All the crap that we all have that we don't need. We don't need a lot of the things that we want. Things we want, we don't need. It's not something that's going to sustain us. We want a new phone. We don't necessarily need a new phone. Advertisers sought to create a single mass market that consumed brand name products. I think they succeeded. The home, as the focus of consumerism, becomes key, especially as electricity spawned new household appliances. So they want new household appliances in every single household. They want them all to be sold. They want every household to have some of these things. And if you think about it, we all do. A coffee pot, a toaster, an oven, now a microwave. Microwaves weren't around back then. A vacuum, washer, eventually a dryer. All the certain things that we use with electricity that are like, oh yeah, we have one of those. You're consuming it. Consumerism at its root, back in the 1920s. Recreation and leisure were important features of the new mass society. Elaborate decorative theaters attracted moviegoers, and movies helped spread common values and help set social trends. Whereas the radio and phonograph also expand entertainment and pop culture. Remember, there's no TV, so your TV is your radio at the time. Phonograph, first time you can listen to music that you want to listen to. It's pretty awesome. Country blues and especially jazz becomes popular. Professional sports also prosper and become more commercialized. Baseball, boxing, and football drew huge crowds. You can see this at the Sunset Cafe in 1922 as a jazz band is playing, and you'd have a full band out there. You have your new age women dancing up there, and the era was the era of non-alcohol consumption, but all these places had alcohol served. The promotion of consumption and immediate gratification weakened traditional self-restraint and fueled the need for personal fulfillment. We want it now, like I said earlier. Sexual pleasure becomes an open objective, meaning people are having sexual relations before they get married. It becomes more of a norm. And society sort of splits. Young people embody this new morality. They embrace new dances, bootleg liquor, smoking, women revealing clothing, sexual experimentation. The new morality was not as widespread or as new critics and advocates suggested. You have the flapper. You have the typical flapper, which I don't have a picture of. But you have the flapper, short bobbed hair, red lipstick, lots of makeup, revealing clothing, but it's not as it's allowed to be that every woman is like this. Many writers rejected the materialism, conformity, and the idea of a developing a mass culture. Their critics made the 1920s a fertile literature decade. They're called the Lost Generation. These writers had responded to the brutality and hypocrisy of war with disillusionment and alienation. Alienation? Oh, can't even say it. Alienation. And the big problem is how do we get past this? Consumerism is what is pushed, but consumerism isn't what's needed as far as what these writers, aka the Lost Generation, say. After years of campaigning for immigrant restrictions, nativists succeeded in passing legislation that imposed literacy tests on immigrants. So now you have to speak English, or be able to read English anyways. The National Origin Act of 1924 placed strict quotas, like we did with Japanese Americans, on immigration that worked against Eastern and Southern Europeans because they weren't coming into the country in high numbers at the time, and so when the quota set, their numbers are lower. In Western states, Japanese were prohibited from owning or leasing land and were blocked from becoming citizens. However, Filipinos are not subject to the National Origins Act and migrated in heavy numbers to the United States. Huge numbers, because remember, they are part of America just like the Puerto Ricans were. And that is the reading 694 through 703.